Hello students, welcome to the first of several lectures in Japanese 3900. This lecture is entitled Gods and Monsters from Shinto and Buddhism to Manga and Anime. And as the title suggests, we're going to be thinking about Japanese religious practices and also Japanese frightening, scary monsters. Now, for us in the contemporary world, post-enlightenment world of science and rationality and reason, we often think of monsters as more something of the past, maybe something to enjoy, to have fun with in a movie theater. But monsters, of course, are very terrifying things, especially in their historical context. We'll be thinking about monsters and how they might be important to Japanese folklore, and also how those monsters get represented in contemporary worlds of manga and anime. In particular, we're going to be thinking about Shinto and Buddhism, which are two religious forms, religious systems we might call them, that have existed in Japan for centuries and that continue to influence Japanese spectators and also the creation of Japanese manga and anime. So let me start by asking if you know KonMari. KonMari, who I'm referring to here in Japanese name order with her family name first, is a well-known TV personality, also a real proponent for home organization. During the corona pandemic period, she became quite popular in the United States. Her method, what's called the KonMari method, being exported from Japan to overseas markets, English-speaking markets. One of the things that KonMari asks of us when we look around our home environments, which may be cluttered with toys, clothing, all kinds of things, she asks us to ask of the objects. Do they spark joy in us anymore? Are they part of our lives anymore? In this way, KonMari is asking us to speak in some way to the spirit of the object. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with manga, with anime, or even with today's topic, which is Japanese religious practices? And it's precisely here in the idea of the spirit of the object. So the word anima is the Latin word for spirit. It can be used in all kinds of ways, but it's also the same word, the same root of the word animation. Now this is something that may be just a kind of curiosity or a coincidence of a kind, but the idea of the spirit of an object is deeply related to the concept of animation itself. In animation, we take still images and we bring them to life. Similarly, we take perhaps concept stories and we invest in them a new power and a new energy. So let's think about this idea of the spirit of the object and how it might itself have a long history in the Japanese context. So KonMari is known, as I said before, for the KonMari method, asks us to spark joy, asks us to think about the object as whether it's sparking joy in us or not. She asks us to decide if it no longer sparks joy, if it no longer has that power in relation to us, that we thank the object for its service before disposing of it. In some ways, KonMari is asking us to communicate with the object. Now, we can all anthropomorphize, we can all create human-like avatars, etc. But to really deeply believe that the object has a spirit and that spirit can communicate with us is perhaps an unspoken spiritual, or we might call it even religious concept that lurks behind or that resides behind this particular home organization method. If you're interested, you can check out Tidying Up, which is on Netflix, or you could even take a look at a manga version of KonMari's method and her principles in a manga entitled The Life-Changing Manga of Tidying Up. So where does this come from? this idea of spirits residing in objects. We can find it in Shinto. So Shinto is literally in Japanese, Shin, meaning gods, and To, meaning way. Shin can also be pronounced Kami, or God, yes. And here in the image that you see on your screen here, we can see the entranceway to a Japanese shrine. Let me point out these two words, shrine and temple. I'm going to be using them very precisely in today's lecture and whenever in the course that we'll be following. A shrine is specific to Shintoism. Well, we use the word temple when referring to a Buddhist temple, right? And there's a difference between Shintoism and Buddhism, and we'll explore that shortly. So here we see a torii gate. Literally, it means a place for birds to perch upon. It's a kind of charming name, but this actually indicates the entrance to a holy site, the entrance to a religious site. Now, what exactly is Shinto? Is Shinto a religious belief system? In some ways, we'd have to say no. There is not any central text. There's not a religious system, perhaps, or ideology associated with Shinto. Shinto, in fact, is a ritual practice. Shinto is very much concerned with the clarification and purification of in-spaces and out-spaces. So these torii gates, and here we can see one with a beautiful sunset behind the torii perched here above water. Shinto is very much concerned with clean spaces. Making a space holy, making a space pure is an important ritual. And it's not as if dirt or uncleanliness is associated with sinfulness. There's not a strong concept of sin in Shinto either. It's rather, we might call it, a practice of daily emotional and mental upkeep, right? To keep the world in a kind of order. So let's explore a little bit about Shinto. So Shinto is concerned with thresholds, and this word threshold is one I want to call your attention to because it will come back many times in our course. The word threshold is limina in Latin. Limina, literally meaning that space that is neither inside nor outside a house. It is liminal. And we'll be exploring all kinds of liminal states and the way in which manga and anime are both very concerned with this passage inside and outside, right? You could think about time travel, you could think about transformers. There's so many ways where something is capable of being one thing or another, of one time or another, one place or another. This idea of the transformational moment is really central, not just to Shinto, but also in Japanese cultural products like anime and manga. So you must be familiar with sumo. So sumo is a Japanese wrestling practice, and it's also a very important, we could call it, custom that relates to Shinto. Here, a sumo wrestler is performing a ritual before the wrestling bout, summoning the gods. His wrestling bout will be a performance for the gods to enjoy. And we can see around his waist a very, very large rope. This is circling his waist, and hanging down from it are some pieces of paper that look almost like lightning. Now, think of rope. Rope is bound, threads, grasses, rope together, weave together, connected, and rope itself connects one thing to another. So very much here in Shinto, the idea of connection, the idea of two separate things being linked is also crucial. And we could view that in some ways as the inverse, or the relation, the opposite, but of the same coin, the opposite side of the same coin, of the idea of liminality. If liminality is something that is both two things at the same time, but neither, the rope clearly indicates two separate things that are connected. And this idea of connection is, of course, really crucial. Even Japanese rice balls, one of the most fundamental foods, are called musubi, which indicates the connection of two hands, the connection of the hand to the mouth, the connection of food to our life. This idea of connection is really central in Shinto. Here we see the same idea of a rope connecting two rocks. And you can see at the very top of the rock on the left-hand side a small torii gate. And of course the rocks themselves are at a liminal space at the threshold. They are both in the water but also close enough to the shore, right? The shoreline, the land. This idea of being in between and also connecting. And I do, you will see also hanging down from that rope are again symbols of connection. Just like those lightning pieces of paper also symbolize a connection between the heavenly and the earthly. So it's in this way that Japanese Shinto belief systems are really crucial to an understanding, Japanese understandings of themselves as people connected to other people, but also Japanese understandings of their own history. On the left-hand side, we can see Izanami and Izanagi, two well-known godlike figures. Now, let me pause here just to describe a little bit what are the Shinto gods. When we use the word God, we often will think in a monotheistic way, for example, thinking that comes associated with Islam or with Christianity or Judaism, of a single God. But in the Japanese case, there are many. Think perhaps of Greek myth and Greek mythology, the numerous gods. It's said that Shintoism has 8 million gods. Well, 8 million is an awful lot, and that doesn't mean someone's counted them. 8 million is basically a euphemism or another way of saying many, many, many. So where are the gods? What are they? Well, when we use a name like Izanami and Izanagi, they may seem like people. But gods, in fact, can come in many different forms. And often these forms are inanimate objects. A stone might have a spirit to it, but also a mountain, a volcano, of course, something that is awe-inspiring, that is perhaps capable of moving the human soul and the human heart. Those kinds of things can be gods. So we can think of personages like Izanami and Izanagi, but we can also think of important physical elements of the natural world. A wind, and sometimes these are even abstract. Maybe the mountain has a god, but maybe actually the god isn't the mountain itself, it's the V-shaped silhouette that appears at a particular time of the day, right? The silhouette between two mountains. So in this sense, almost anything that inspires the human soul can be considered godlike. Also our ancestors could also be themselves gods. So here in the image we see Izanami and Izanagi, who are founders of the Japanese nation in the most literal sense. Stirring a spear in the mists of antiquity, they drop pieces of dew from the sword, condensed water, but also, we might say, the spit of the gods, their sweat, their excrement, their urine. Even these things drop from the heavens and create the many, many islands that are the archipelago of Japan. Here on the right-hand side of the image you see Amaterasu, the most important of the Japanese gods. Here, the goddess of the sun, appearing as an irezumi, or a Japanese-style tattoo. So I've mentioned Amaterasu, and Amaterasu is, if we might say, the original god. Not the earliest god, but the original god, in the sense that it's understood that the emperor of Japan and the imperial family are descendants of Amaterasu. So in this sense, a kind of holiness in the imperial family, a divinity in the imperial family. And the story of Amaterasu is the story of the sun, the story that's also symbolized in the Japanese flag, which is sun, rising, of course, from the east, rising from the ocean, and is that sun that is the symbol of Japan. Now, Amaterasu was feeling a little slighted, left out, and she hid herself away in a cave. And of course, when the sun hides itself away, it's very hard for plants to grow. The other gods were worried. What can they do to lure Amaterasu out of her cave and to bring the sun back into its existence in our world? Well, one of Amaterasu's cousins, Amano Uzume, thought she would do something like a pole dance of millennia ago. Here, a very erotic dance, and we can see even the image, Amano Uzume is exposing her genitalia, which caused all the other gods to have so much fun. They were laughing and drinking and enjoying themselves that Amaterasu became so curious. What's all that fun? Why am I being left out even more? And she slowly got her resolve and left her cave. And so began the sun again, and ultimately began the Japanese nation. We're going to take a look now at a video that is an early animation from 1931 of the Japanese national anthem, Kimi ga Yo. And this anthem is, the lyrics for it are given on the left-hand side of the screen. How was that? Could you see the Izanami and Izanagi creating the Japanese nation? Could you see Amaterasu and the sun returning? This was an example of Japanese Chiyogami animation from 1931 by Noburo Ofuji Noburo. This is one of the founders, we could say, of Japanese animation, and using printed, delicately printed paper. So this is a kind of cut out animation, right? And we'll talk about different forms of animation in this class, but the first animation that we're encountering is this paper. It's a kind of stop motion animation where paper is moved around in front of the camera. So we're going to be continuing on from this to see how Shintoism becomes an important source for ideas of monsters and spirits and how those inhabit manga and anime. Now, I think you're familiar with Studio Ghibli. Studio Ghibli is one of the most important sources of animation in today's world. It's regarded alongside Disney as a powerhouse of creativity. But Studio Ghibli draws very significantly from the Japanese traditions of monsters and spirits and ghosts. We will explore in this course, and particularly in this module, yokai. Yokai are the Japanese name to refer to monsters. Now, Miyazaki Hayao sometimes says, no, I'm really not just recreating Japanese yokai. And as a director, I certainly understand his unique creativity. But at the same time, we can clearly see lots of relations between Studio Ghibli productions. And of course, Miyazaki is perhaps the head animator, the most significant animator at Studio Ghibli. We can see the connections in his work to Japanese stories of monsters and story of, we could say, kami who have gone awry, spirits who are unhappy. Now, in Shintoism, there isn't a sense of an afterlife, and there isn't really even a strong sense of sin. But gods, while not being omnipotent, are able to create misfortune for humans. So often, humans will seek to entertain them, to revere them, to respect them, but also to placate them at certain times as well. Now, when we take a look at Ghibli's work, and we take a look particularly at Miyazaki's work, something like Spirited Away, we can see the presence of all kinds of gods, all coming together here in a Japanese bathhouse. Now, some of these gods may be closer to what we would call a monster. So the difference between a god and a monster is something we'll explore a little bit later. But think of these monsters as spirits, spirits who contain certain kinds of wisdom, but also emotions, right? Let's take a look here at this image. This is an image of a Japanese parade of monsters. This image is from the Edo period, so a period that was from 1600 to around 1868. And we see in here a kind of collection of all kinds of demons, spirits, monsters, goblins, getting together for what we might call a party. Very similar to the idea in Spirited Away of the gods all assembling at a bathhouse to, of course, clean themselves. In Shinto, the whole idea of cleanliness is very, very important. In Japanese anime, we see a strong presence of this motif, the motif of the parade of demons, the parade of monsters, the parade of yokai, we could call it. And we'll take a look here at this clip from the bathhouse scene where Lin guides the protagonist, Chihiro, through the bathhouse. And we see, in many ways, this assembly of so many different kinds of gods and demons. How is that? These two clips that we've seen both suggest what is called the night parade of 100 demons, Hyakki, Yagyo, Emaki. So an emaki is literally a hand scroll. A scroll that you unwind with your hands and you look at the image horizontally, opening it up as much as your table or your tatami floor mat will allow, and rolling it on the other side as you open it on the left. And here is another very common, this very common motif of the demons all assembled in a parade. So why do the demons get together? And are there really 100 of them? No, much more than 100. 100 here is like the term earlier of the 8 million gods. It just means many, right? Not as many as 8 million, certainly, but it's definitely a lot of demons have assembled. Now these demon or yokai, we could also call them monsters. We can also think of them as part of the world of Shinto spirits. So very crucial in this, we could say, night parade of demons, and crucial also in anime and manga and in Japanese cute goods, are daily objects. Objects that live in our house. A guitar, a flashlight, a sandal, these kinds of, an old kettle, right? These kinds of tools, the tools that KonMari is suggesting that we have a conversation with, these are things that litter or inhabit helpfully our daily lives. These are tool specters or tool gods. We can see here on the bottom left an image of a lantern that's torn. On the right-hand side, an umbrella, and of course above it, as I referred to before, the flashlight, the guitar, etc. These tools, these objects, they have a spirit to them. And why do these spirits become angry? Why do these spirits cause trouble and go on a night parade, so to speak? Because those night parades are good for the demons, but not very good for humans, right? You could lose your life if you happen to get caught up in a night parade of 100 demons. Well, this is because the objects have been abused. A tool is very happy to be used. A tool loves its own usefulness. But when that tool is neglected, when the broken tool is not repaired nor discarded, when the very useful instrument is left unplayed for decades, then the kami inside, the spirit inside, becomes enraged. Now we could understand this as a Japanese concept of efficiency, of taking good care of objects, of being resourceful, avoiding wastefulness. Yes, this is in some ways common sense, but it's also a religious practice. For certain kinds of tools, you can take them to your local shrine and they can be burnt so the spirit can be released into a new life. We're going to explain these kami and explain these demons and how they became crucial in a competition about religion. So we've talked about Shintoism so far, but we haven't talked about Buddhism. So Buddhism is arriving in Japan in the 6th century, and it arrives in various ways. And of course, it enters into a certain kind of competition with Shintoism. Here's a new religious way of thinking that does have a whole set of texts, a whole set of, we could say, revered philosophical principles, right? In many ways, a very intellectualized system of belief. We're going to explain the popularity and the frequency of this image, this motif of the night parade, by considering how these objects with spirits are actually part of a conversation and a competition between different forms of religious practice. We've talked about Shintoism, but we haven't yet talked about Buddhism. Let's take a look at this contemporary map of religious belief in Asia today. On the western left-hand side of this map, in red and in green, we see areas of Hindu faith and the Muslim faith. These are not forms of Buddhism. But on the eastern or right-hand side of this map, we see magenta, we see yellow, and we see an orange. These represent the three main schools of Buddhism. The magenta area is Vajrayana Buddhism, which is known in the United States also as Tibetan or esoteric Buddhism. I'll explain that in a moment. The orange area is associated with, say, places like Burma, Thailand, and this is called Theravada Buddhism. It's in the area on the right, or the far east of this map, that we see the Mahayana Buddhism, which is the kind of Buddhism that's practiced in China, Korea, Japan, and also Vietnam. So let's consider how the arrival of Buddhism in Japan prompted the use of these tool specters as a kind of religious form of proselytizing, of conversion. Now, when we think about these major forms of Buddhism, we can think about your image, perhaps, of a Buddhist priest, maybe an image of a priest in saffron-colored, yellow or orange-colored robes. Those are associated with Theravada Buddhism, Southeast Asian Buddhism. And this is a form of Buddhism that heavily relies on individual discipline and individual training. The monks must spend time on the streets begging for assistance as a means to rid themselves of too much desire for worldly things, to make themselves poor. That's part of the practice here of Theravada Buddhism. But that's not a kind of Buddhism that we see in Japan. In Japan, we see Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. The monks are wearing brown or black robes. Visually, you could tell these different forms of Buddhism. And let's explore a little bit more in detail Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism, and how those two different, we could say, schools or types of Buddhism created the competition that led to the popularization of the tool specters and the night parade. So this is a very detailed, complex chart here of different schools of Buddhism. And the kinds of Buddhism that we see on the bottom right and on the left, Vajrayana and Mahayana, are the ones that concern us today. The majority of the Buddhist faiths in Japan are Mahayana. Unlike Theravada, they emphasize the importance of Buddha's compassion. It's really the compassion of the Buddha that allows us to become a better person, become a better being, to have a chance at becoming enlightened and reaching nirvana. So this idea in Buddhism of reincarnation, of one life being followed by another life, followed by another life, the idea of karma is very central. And karma is moving us towards a certain kind of wisdom and enlightenment that the Buddha, originally an Indian prince, represents. So in Japanese Mahayana Buddhism, we see a whole series of different religious sects emerging, but in competition with them, there was another form of Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, which is coming from Tibet. And we see this it's much a kind of a minor note. It's not as dominant in contemporary Japan, but these esoteric forms of Buddhism are very important for our history of monsters and demons. Why? Esoteric Buddhism emphasized the idea that it was really not individual discipline and suffering, nor the compassion of the Buddha, but rather the secret passage of knowledge from the priest to his acolytes, from the priest to his community, the secret, we could say, esoteric, hidden passage of knowledge that brought the possibility of salvation. And in the Japanese context, there's one form of Buddhism, Shingon Buddhism, that's coming directly from this Tibetan esoteric source. It was trying to advertise itself as being a more competent and more reliable form of belief. So if you're going to still believe in kami, which you can, you should also choose a form of Buddhism that's going to recognize the power of the kami. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a confluence, a mixture of Buddhism and kami and Shintoism. And it's in particular this esoteric form of Buddhism that tried to advertise itself as being more effective at bringing Japanese kami into the world of the Buddha. So Shingon esoteric Buddhism emphasized that paths to salvation can be communicated through mantras and through mandalas. It emphasized the secrecy of rituals. And here, crucial to our point today, that Shingon esoteric Buddhism appealed to the broad powers of salvation that could save not just sentient beings, but also plants and inanimate objects. So this was claiming that Buddhism, this particular form of Buddhism, could save those things that Japanese were already revering, the spirits inside objects. And it's in this way that the idea of the tool specter, the idea of all the gods assembling in one space for their night parade became an important motif. So the night parade of 100 demons is a popular form of entertainment today. We can derive a lot of pleasure from it. It's probably a bit more frightening a few hundred years ago in the Edo period in Japan. But if we think back to 700-800 years ago, it was very much part of this communication about bringing the spirits of Japanese Shintoism into the Buddhist tradition. And we see here a syncretism of Shinto kami and the Buddha, the idea of the Buddha coming from India, Tibet, and China. Well, I thank you for your attention today. It's a little bit confusing, perhaps, and we can unpack this further. And don't hesitate to, of course, make comments in the discussion if you have questions, or also if you have observations. But we're going to be further exploring how these yokai came to occupy the Japanese imagination and how they came to really influence manga and anime today. It's ultimately a homonym. This idea of a tool or of a container, ki, is the same sound as the idea of the word for an ogre, a monster or a demon. This one word, this one sound, able to link two separate things. And sometimes it's as simple as that. Sometimes just two words sounding alike can set a whole tradition into motion. I look forward to seeing you at our next lecture.